The scars on his throat were not an accident. They were a warning, carved there by the very man who bowed lowest before the throne. When the silenced Omega was dragged into the great hall and dropped as a gift at the feet of the Ice King, the entire court believed they were watching an act of mercy. No one knew the truth hidden beneath the silk, that the man offering this gift had once poisoned a king's beloved consort and silenced a servant who saw too much. But what none of them could have predicted was this. The crown resting on the king's brow was about to let him hear every single thought inside that silenced mind. What was he about to discover? Stay until the end to find out. Before we begin, let us set the scene for you, a silenced Omega, a throne room full of liars, and a king who is about to hear thoughts no one was ever supposed to hear. If you have ever daydreamed about what it would be like to fall for royalty for just one day, we want to know in the comments. Rhys died the way he'd have chosen, if anyone had bothered to ask him. He was 3 plates deep into a deadlift PR, eyes watering, veins doing their best impression of rope, when his phone buzzed on the gym floor. It was an update notification. His favorite Omegaverse serial had finally dropped the chapter he'd been refreshing for all week. His grip faltered for exactly 1/10 of a second. That was all it took. The bar came down, gravity did its unglamorous job, and that was the end of Rhys's 28 years on Earth, killed in action by his own curiosity and 400 pounds of iron. He woke up somewhere else entirely, and he felt oddly fine about it. No gym membership fees waiting to be auto-drafted from an account that no longer technically existed. No regrets, really, beyond the fact that he'd never find out what happened in that last chapter. Small problem, though. His new circumstances came with a few complications. He was an Omega now. He was somebody's concubine, and he could not make a single sound. The silence wasn't a birth defect. It was a message. Lord Voss, the reptilian head of the Privy Council, had personally seen to that. The boy whose body Rhys now wore had once been invisible household staff in Voss's private residence. The kind of servant nobody looks twice at, right up until that servant sees something he was never meant to see. What he'd seen, Rhys would find out later, was worth more than his life, so Voss hadn't killed him. He'd done something quieter and in its own way crueler. He'd crushed the boy's vocal cords, dressed him in silk so fine it could pass for penance, and shipped him off as a gift to a grieving king, proof, to anyone watching, of the council's generosity. Rhys took stock of his new body in a standing mirror before anyone could stop him. He mourned his old bulk a little, the lat spread, the traps he'd spent 6 years building. But this frame wasn't nothing. Lean, efficient, built for speed rather than mass, with a core that felt disturbingly solid for someone who'd apparently spent his life folding laundry. I can work with this, he decided. A guard grabbed his wrist and pressed something scalding into the back of his neck before he could finish admiring himself. He didn't flinch. Years of powerlifting had taught him that flinching just wastes energy you'll need later, but the brand stung like a hot poker for a good 10 seconds. It left behind an intricate crest of interlocking iron thorns, the royal seal. The council believed it was purely ceremonial, a mark of ownership stamped into every gift sent to the throne. They were wrong about that, though nobody in the room knew it yet. Voss had made sure of it. The doors to the great hall opened, and a guard nudged Rhys forward into a cavern of black marble, silver banners, and the low murmur of several hundred nobles who'd clearly never learned to whisper quietly. The air smelled like hot wax and polished steel. Rhys kept his spine straight and his steps smooth, playing the part he'd absorbed from a truly unreasonable number of web novels. The tragic, silent flower, delicate as spun glass. Chin down, shoulders soft, let them underestimate you. It's cheaper than armor. He counted the exits out of old habit as he walked. 2 side doors behind heavy tapestries, 1 set of servant stairs, half hidden near the musician's gallery, filing the information away without really deciding to. Old instincts, apparently, transferred over along with the muscle memory. He noted, too, the way every noble in the room angled their body just slightly toward the throne even while pretending to ignore it, the way court gossip clearly moved faster than official news, and the way not a single guard's eyes ever left the king for more than a few seconds at a time. This was not a peaceful court. This was a room full of people who had learned the hard way to watch each other. At the far end of the hall, on an obsidian throne, sat King Kaelin. They called him the Frost King, not affectionately. He'd lost his consort years earlier to what the court physicians called a wasting sickness, and in the time since, He'd built himself into something colder and harder than grief usually allows. An alpha who ruled through sheer, unshakable discipline and looked at this exact moment like he would rather be anywhere else. A slim silver circlet sat on his brow, the crown of resonance, an artifact so secret that only a handful of people in the kingdom knew what it actually did. It bonded the wearer's mind to anyone branded with the royal seal, an old defense against bedroom assassins, built centuries ago by a king who trusted nobody, least of all the people he slept beside. Kalen watched the new concubine approach and braced himself for treachery. He expected poison, he expected daggers, secret orders, the particular flavor of malice that came standard issue with anything Voss touched. Rhys reached the base of the throne and dropped smoothly to his knees. He drew a slate and a stick of white chalk from his sleeve, wrote a careful line, and held it up for the king to read. This humble servant offers greetings to the son of the empire. Then he looked up, just a glance, framed by lowered lashes, exactly the way the novels always described it, and his brain short-circuited entirely. The king was enormous, not just tall, engineered. His tunic did nothing to hide the geography underneath it, shoulders like a doorway, a chest that strained the fabric with every breath, forearms that looked like they'd never lost an arm wrestling match in their life. Kaelin braced for a mental broadcast of poison and daggers. Instead, a voice slammed directly into the center of his skull, loud, foreign, and completely unbothered by royal protocol. Okay, that quad sweep is doing something illegal. Kaelin's hands tightened on the armrests. His expression didn't so much as twitch, decades of discipline holding the line, but internally he was already lost. Quad sweep. What in the frozen hells was a quad sweep? Some kind of northern blade? A technique from an assassin's guild he hadn't cracked yet? Rhys kept his eyes demurely on the floor while his internal monologue ran, unfiltered and enthusiastic, straight into the king's head. I would pay real money to see the deltoid separation under that tunic in better lighting. Whoever tailored those trousers deserves an award. Structural engineering, honestly. Ruin my whole life, Your Majesty. I'll wait. A single bead of sweat traced its way down Kaelin's spine. Deltoid separation. He had no framework for that phrase, and yet the intent behind it was unmistakable. Hungry, aggressive, entirely too confident for a servant kneeling at the foot of a throne. This fragile, broken creature in front of him was not plotting an assassination. He was plotting something considerably more scandalous, and doing it with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. Lord Voss chose that moment to step forward, rings flashing in the candlelight, voice smooth as spoiled honey. Your Majesty, the council grieves alongside you. We thought perhaps a little warmth might do your halls some good. He's quiet, obedient, a balm for a weary king. Rhys wrote a single word on his slate: gratitude. While his mind supplied something considerably less polite. Look at this man's posture. Rounded shoulders, forward head carriage, textbook upper cross syndrome. I could fix that with a resistance band and about 4 weeks of consistency, or I could just break his cervical spine right now and save everyone the trouble. Nobody touches my alpha's kingdom. Nobody touches my protein shake. Kaelin actually flinched, a small, involuntary jolt that not one person in that hall had ever seen him make. Protein shake. What kind of terrifying tonic was that? And had this delicate, silenced Omega just threatened, in the space of 2 seconds, to break a sitting lord's neck? He looked at Rhys. Rhys looked back, the very picture of innocence. The V-taper on this man is genuinely unfair, the voice continued, utterly shameless. That lat activation just from sitting there is textbook. He could bench press me, and I would thank him for the privilege. Wreck me structurally. I volunteer. Kaelin's breath caught audibly, his strategic mind, the same mind that had negotiated ceasefires with warlords and outmaneuvered 3 separate assassination plots, scrambled for a foothold and found none. Structural. Was this a demand to dismantle part of the castle? A coded threat against the fortifications? The confusion should have been the dominant feeling. It wasn't. Underneath it, low and unbidden, something else was waking up, and it had nothing to do with strategy. A scent drifted up from the base of the throne, bright, sharp, unmistakably an Omega on the edge of something. It cut through the stale incense of the hall like a blade. Voss, misreading the king's silence for approval, pressed his advantage. He's mute, of course, Your Majesty, but as you can see, perfectly docile. Docile, Rhys thought, watching the king shift in his seat with a private, wicked satisfaction. I am going to climb this man like he's a competition wall. I want to know his 1 rep max. Pin me to a training mat and choke me out a little, purely for research purposes. Kalen closed his eyes. A flush he had not felt since adolescence threatened to climb his throat, and he forced it back down through sheer grinding willpower. He'd faced down warlords. He'd outnegotiated smugglers who'd have gutted a lesser man for looking at them wrong. He had never faced anything quite like this. He opened his eyes, fixed Reese with the coldest stare he could summon, and said in a voice that rolled through the hall like distant thunder, "The council is generous." Oh, that baritone. Reese's mental voice practically purred. That chest capacity is unreal. He could lecture me for 6 hours straight, and I'd just ask for an encore. Kellan broke eye contact first. He stood before his own instincts could finish the job his composure had already lost. "I accept the gift," he said, too fast, and turned before anyone could see the color climbing his neck. "Place him in the east wing. I'll inspect him later." Voss's smile went thin and victorious. "Of course, Your Majesty." Reese bowed until his forehead nearly touched the marble, the perfect image of gratitude, while his mind broadcast one last cheerful thought straight into the crown on the king's head. "Inspect away, Your Majesty. Test my mobility, test my cardiovascular endurance. Bring a towel, we're going to need it." Kalen missed the top step of the dais entirely. He caught himself, boots clanging against stone, and stormed out of the hall at something dangerously close to a jog, cape snapping behind him, ignoring every concerned murmur from his own guards. He needed a cold bath, a stiff drink, and, urgently, a trip to the Royal Archives to find out exactly what a deadlift was, because whatever it was, it sounded like a threat. King Kalen sat behind his obsidian desk, spine ramrod straight, expression carved from stone. He had subdued entire provinces. He had killed things in the frozen wastes that didn't have names anymore because he'd been the last person to see them alive, and he was currently losing, badly, to a mute Omega sitting quietly on a cushion in the corner of his study. He'd chosen to wear the crown of resonance today. That had been a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake even as he made it, and he did it anyway, because some part of him, some part he refused to examine too closely, wanted to keep listening. He told himself it was strategy. Voss's gift needed watching. If treason was coming, better to hear it early. What he got instead was an ongoing, deeply scandalous broadcast that had absolutely nothing to do with treason. Reese sat on his cushion looking like something out of a devotional painting. Dark hair falling just so over a pale, erotic throat. Hands folded demurely in his lap, slate and chalk resting beside him. Kalen flipped a page of trade reports he wasn't reading. "Look at those shoulders," the voice said, warm and entirely too confident. "That kind of density doesn't come from eating pheasant. He's got to be pulling 300 grams of protein a day, easy. I need to know his macros." This is a scientific question now. Kalen's quill creaked under his grip. Macros. Some kind of southern blood magic, surely. The tone, at least, was unambiguous, hungry, appreciative, entirely too interested. Reese, for his part, was running through a mental checklist pulled straight from a stack of novels he'd once read at 2 in the morning instead of sleeping. Chin down, eyes up through the lashes. Let the big scary alpha think he's intimidating you. It costs nothing and it works every time. Kalan heard every word of that strategy in real time and felt something between offense and reluctant, horrified admiration. This man wasn't cowed. He was performing being cowed, with the precision of someone who'd studied the role. It was, infuriatingly, a very good performance. Reese rose with fluid grace, poured a cup of spiced tea, and presented it with both hands, head bowed. "Thank you," Kalen said gruffly, and Reese offered a soft, trembling smile before retreating to his cushion. Nailed it. The internal cheer arrived immediately. 10 out of 10 submissive tea service. "Now drink up, Mountain. Hydration matters. Your skin's looking a little dry, honestly. I'd love to spend 3 hours mapping every inch of that chest with unscented lotion, purely for skincare purposes." Kellen choked on his tea. He set the cup down hard enough to crack the saucer and stood so fast his chair scraped a foot backward. "I require exercise," he announced to no one in particular. "You'll observe from the balcony." Cardio time, Reese thought gleefully, already halfway out the door. Let's see this man sweat. The courtyard was gray stone and bitter wind, lined with weapon racks and guards, who watched their king with the particular reverence you reserve for something that might, on a bad day, kill you by accident. Kalen stripped off his cloak and tunic without ceremony, kept the crown firmly on his head. He wanted to keep hearing this, some traitorous part of him admitted, and selected a broadsword heavy enough that most men needed both hands and a running start. He swung it in a lazy one-handed arc and settled into a stance. Up on the balcony, Rhys leaned over the railing, slate forgotten. That lat activation is unreal. His hips alone could probably cause a minor earthquake. Kalen stumbled on a pivot. He caught himself and gritted his teeth, refocusing on his footwork. I want him to use that grip strength on me, the thoughts continued, sliding from admiration into something considerably darker. I want those hands around my waist. I want him to test my structural integrity and find out exactly where it fails. The demand hit Kalen like a physical blow. His brain stalled entirely on structural integrity. Was the Omega asking him to demolish something? A wall? A section of the keep? And then the scent reached him. Sharp, sweet, unmistakably intentional. And the confusion collapsed into something with a much simpler explanation. The broadsword slipped from his grip and hit the paving stones with a clang loud enough to silence the entire yard. His boots tangled. The king, who had never lost his footing in 30 years of combat, went down hard, flat on his back in the dirt, in front of a dozen guards who had genuinely never seen this happen before. He lay there for a long moment, staring at the gray sky, heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. Rhys leaned over the railing, face arranged into perfect, delicate concern, and scribbled quickly on his slate, holding it up so the king could read it from the ground. Is the great king injured? Shall I fetch a healer? Kalen glared at the innocent handwriting and said absolutely nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. The guards, to their enormous credit, managed to keep straight faces while helping their monarch to his feet, brushing dirt off his back with the grim efficiency of men who understood their continued employment depended on never mentioning this again. One of the older captains, a grizzled veteran who'd served under 3 kings and buried 2 of them, allowed himself the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth before smoothing it back into professional blankness. Kalen noticed. He decided, magnanimously, to let it go, mostly because starting a second incident in front of his own honor guard felt like exactly the kind of thing that would make the day considerably worse. He retrieved the broadsword himself, waving off the servant who darted forward to do it for him, and drove it back into its rack with more force than strictly necessary. Then he turned on his heel and marched inside without another word, deliberately not looking up at the balcony again, aware, with the specific, hunted awareness of a man being watched by someone who found the entire spectacle deeply entertaining, that Rhys was almost certainly still up there, chin on his hand, cataloging every second of the retreat for future commentary. He was, in fact, entirely correct about that. Kalen paced the length of the royal library, ignoring every shelf around him. His mind was stuck on a single word, dumbbell. He'd heard it in the concubine's thoughts and dismissed it, and then it had kept surfacing, and now it wouldn't leave. He'd faced enough smiling assassins to know that real threats like to hide behind harmless names. He summoned Rhys to get answers. Rhys arrived looking immaculate, bowed with practiced grace, and held up his slate. Does my king require a particular text? Underneath the polite question, his mind was already somewhere else entirely, brooding alpha alone in a candlelit library. This is basically a trope achievement unlocked. I require answers, Kalen said, stepping closer, jaw tight. You hide behind that slate, but I know you serve Voss. Rhys blinked, genuinely startled, and wrote quickly, This servant serves only the crown. That jaw tension is doing something for me. His mind added, unhelpfully, 10 out of 10. Tell me, Kalen pressed, closing the distance further. What is a dumbbell? Where is it kept? Rhys stared, caught somewhere between confusion and delight, and a mental laugh rolled straight into the king's head. He thinks it's a weapon. Oh, that's adorable, adorable. The word landed like an insult. Kalen's control slipped for exactly 1 second, long enough to lunge forward and reach for Rhys's shoulders, and long enough for his boot to catch a slick patch of marble underfoot. The great Frost King once again lost his footing. Rhys didn't freeze. Old reflexes, years of grappling, hundreds of hours logged on a mat, kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. He stepped into the fall, twisted at the hip, and used his own body as a fulcrum to redirect several 100 pounds of falling king safely past a side table and down onto a plush rug instead of the floor. The landing knocked the wind out of Kalen. When he opened his eyes, Rhys was sitting squarely on top of him in a perfect straddle, hands resting lightly on his chest. Oh, excellent mount, Rhys thought, positively glowing. Flawless execution. Best day of my life, honestly. Kalen couldn't move. The proximity, the scent, the sheer physical fact of Reese sitting on him. It overwhelmed every ounce of rational thought he had left. His hands came up on instinct, gripping Reese's waist, and with a low growl he reversed their positions in a single fluid motion, pinning Reese's wrists to the rug and looming over him. Their eyes locked. The air between them went electric. Yes, Reese's mind screamed, entirely unguarded. I am so ready for this. This is exactly the kind of tension I have to fade out on here. Things get considerably more heated in the full version, which, again, lives on the Patreon. Back to the story. Just as Kalen's iron discipline reached its absolute limit, a wildly incongruous thought sliced through the haze. I'll make you protein pancakes every morning if you keep this up. Protein pancakes? Kalen froze mid-motion. His chest heaved. He lifted his head slowly and looked down at Reese, who looked back entirely unbothered, smiling like he hadn't just derailed a royal breakdown with breakfast. Rational thought slammed back into place all at once. Kalen released Reese's wrists and scrambled backward, off the rug and onto his feet, face burning. Stay there, he ordered, voice cracking on the last word. Do not follow me. Reese propped himself up on his elbows, offering a smile that could only be described as smug. Run, big alpha. I can wait. 10 out of 10. Kalen fled toward the armory, telling himself firmly that it had been a fluke, a slick floor, nothing more. A delicate concubine could not possibly be a trained fighter. He needed to hit something. He needed, more urgently, to understand how a mute man with a slate had taken him down twice in a single week. Kalen spent the next 3 days avoiding the East Wing entirely. He drowned himself in statecraft, trade negotiations, border reports, hours in the training yard until his arms shook. None of it erased the memory of the library. He could still feel the exact pressure of Reese's thighs, still catch phantom traces of that scent whenever his guard slipped. He locked the crown of resonance in a velvet box. Without it amplifying the signal from a distance, the broadcasts from the East Wing finally, blessedly, stopped. He told himself this was about discipline. It was really about fear, the specific, unfamiliar fear of losing control to someone he'd known for less than a week. Reese, meanwhile, found the king's sudden disappearing act deeply funny. He filled his days exploring his new quarters, discovered his body handled soreness with irritating efficiency, and kept up a light routine of push-ups and planks between naps, cataloging his new physiology like a man running diagnostics on a machine. Fast twitch fibers, excellent. Cardiovascular base, enviable. Boredom, rapidly becoming a serious problem. Without his favorite view to stare at, Reese decided to make himself useful instead. He needed to understand the political landscape he'd landed in, and specifically, he needed to understand Voss, the man who'd handed him over like a party favor and personally overseen the ruin of his throat. Dressed simply, slate and chalk tucked into his sleeve, Reese made his way to the medical archives in the southern tower. An elderly archivist guarded the door. Reese bowed low and held up a note. This humble servant seeks texts on remedies for a damaged throat. The old man took one look at the scarring on Reese's neck, softened immediately, and waved him toward the botanical section, leaving him to browse alone. Reese ignored the herbal texts entirely. He was after something else. The court gossip he'd overheard mentioned a waist sickness that had taken the king's previous consort. He wanted the physician's actual notes. He found a locked case in the back of the room, picked the primitive lock with a hairpin in about 8 seconds, and pulled the relevant ledger. The handwriting was archaic and cramped, but the clinical details held up fine across several centuries of medical progress. Officially, the cause of death had been recorded as an imbalance of bodily humors. The listed symptoms told a very different story. Severe abdominal cramping, persistent vomiting, a distinctive blue line along the gums, sudden hair loss, progressive nerve damage, tremors, and finally organ failure. Reese sat very still. His years of pre-med coursework, abandoned somewhere around the time he'd decided powerlifting was more his speed, flared back to life all at once. This wasn't a wasting sickness. This was textbook, heavy metal poisoning, most likely arsenic or lead, delivered in careful, deliberate doses over months. Somebody had murdered the king's consort slowly enough to make it look natural. He flipped back through the earlier entries, checking dates against the timeline of symptoms, and the pattern held up under scrutiny. Worse, it sharpened it. The dosing hadn't been erratic. It had been methodical, tapered up over roughly 16 weeks, exactly the kind of slow escalation a patient chemist would use to avoid triggering suspicion in a court physician who'd never seen a deliberate poisoning in his life. Whoever had done this hadn't been improvising. They'd planned it the way a general plans a siege. Quietly, patiently, confident nobody would think to look until it was far too late to matter. The consort's name, buried near the bottom of the final entry almost as an afterthought, was Soren. Rhys traced the letters with one finger. Nobody in the palace spoke that name anymore, he'd noticed. Not the servants, not the nobles, not even the guards who'd clearly served long enough to remember him. Grief that deep usually got talked around rather than talked about. Rhys wondered, with a fresh stab of anger, whether that silence had been cultivated too. One more thing Voss had quietly encouraged. Because a king too heartbroken to ask questions was a king who never noticed his treasury shrinking. The question answered itself almost immediately. Who benefits from a grieving, heirless king? Who gains power over a monarch too consumed by loss to look too closely at his own council? Voss, an heir would secure the throne and cut the council's leverage in half. A functional, focused king was a threat to men who liked their monarchs distracted. And then a second, colder thought landed. Rhys's own silenced throat suddenly made a great deal more sense. The original owner of this body hadn't just been random staff. He'd seen something, mixing, measuring, something he shouldn't have. And Voss had made a calculated choice. Killing him outright would raise questions. A quietly ruined servant, gifted away as an act of generosity, raised none at all. Rhys gripped the edge of the reading table, fury settling deep and cold in his chest. This wasn't even his own grief, not technically, but it burned all the same. And underneath it, something sharper. Voss had done this to his king. Kaelin had spent years mourning a murder dressed up as an illness, isolated by a man who wanted higher taxes and looser oversight more than he'd ever wanted the kingdom to heal. Nobody gets away with that, Rhys decided. He shelved the ledger exactly where he'd found it, wrote a courteous note of thanks for the archivist, and walked out with the posture of the perfect demure servant, his mind running a mile a minute in a completely different direction. Across the castle, Kaelin reluctantly put the crown back on for a council meeting he couldn't avoid. He braced for gym slang and glute commentary. Instead, a voice colder than the northern wind cut straight through his skull. Voss poisoned him. Kaelin's quill snapped in his hand. Ink bled across the trade documents in front of him. Heavy metal toxicity. Lead or arsenic, most likely both. It's all in the medical records. The blue line on the gums, the nerve damage. That was never a sickness. That was a slow, deliberate murder. Kaelin stared at the far wall, lungs suddenly too small for the room. Assassination. The wasting sickness that had baffled every physician in the palace for years, and a mute concubine had just handed him the truth from across the castle without breaking stride. He ruined my throat because I knew, Rhys's thoughts continued, vibrating with something closer to rage than he usually allowed himself. That man with the terrible posture and the worst ethics murdered an innocent person, and then destroyed a servant to bury it. Kaelin rose so fast his chair scraped loudly across stone. Betrayal, treason. Years of quiet grief engineered by the very man he'd trusted to run half his government. It all crashed down at once. Then the tone shifted. The cold fury melted into something fiercer and warmer at the same time. He isolated him for years. I won't let that stand. I'll find the proof Rhys promised the empty archives, and it landed perfectly across the castle. I'll expose him. And then I'll dislocate every joint in his body one at a time, starting with whichever one screams first. Nobody touches my alpha. Kaelin let out a long, unsteady breath. Something that had been frozen solid for years cracked, then shattered completely. He'd braced himself for a spy. He'd found one, technically, just not the kind he'd expected. Underneath the strange terminology and the relentless physical commentary, Rhys was fiercely, uncompromisingly loyal, ready to go to war against the most powerful man in the kingdom to protect him. He still had no idea what a protein shake was. It didn't matter anymore. The sentiment came through loud and clear. Kaelin pulled the crown off, didn't bother putting it away, and strode out of his study at a pace that scattered guards from his path. Voss was a dead man walking. But first, Kaelin needed to find his Omega and make absolutely certain he was safe. Rhys walked briskly back toward the east wing, mind still running calculations on toxic load and evidence. He pushed open the door to his quarters and stopped cold. Voss stood in the middle of his sitting room, flanked by 2 armed guards, wearing the same oily smile he always wore. Reese closed the door behind himself and kept his posture perfectly relaxed, running an involuntary assessment on the man in front of him. Anterior pelvic tilt, rounded shoulders, zero core engagement. I could put him on the ground with one finger. He crossed to his desk instead, picked up a fresh slate and wrote, "Your visit honors this servant, my lord. How may I assist the council?" Voss stepped in close, deliberately crowding him. "Settling in well, I see. You look healthier than the day I found you in the lower city. The king's been generous with his time." He's trying to corner me, Reese thought. Terrible spatial awareness. One hip toss and he's on the floor. "I'm pleased," Voss went on, reaching up to stroke his beard. "But remember your place, little bird. I plucked you out of nothing. I gave you silk and purpose. Don't let the king's temporary interest cloud your memory." He reached out and gripped Reese's chin, jeweled fingers digging into his jaw, tilting his head up. "You belong to the council. You're my eyes and my ears in this palace. If the king moves against the military budget, you'll find a way to tell me. Understood?" Voss's guards shifted near the doorway, bored, clearly used to this particular routine. The veiled threats, the possessive hand on the chin, the slow patronizing lecture about knowing one's place. Reese filed that away too. This wasn't the first time Voss had done this to someone in this room. It was practiced, rehearsed, a man who intimidated servants for a hobby, and had clearly never once considered that one of them might intimidate back. Reese held perfectly still, staring back without a flicker of fear, entirely distracted by a sharp, sudden smell cutting through Voss's heavy cologne. Bitter, metallic, faintly like crushed almonds and old copper, radiating straight off the man's rings. His new omega senses, apparently far sharper than anything human, delivered the diagnosis instantly, backed up by every hour of pre-med he'd ever half-finished. Refined heavy metal residue, the exact compound described in the archive ledger. Voss hadn't just poisoned a consort years ago, he was still doing it, still mixing fresh batches, the filigree of his rings acting as a perfect trap for toxic dust. He was, quite literally, wearing the murder weapon on his hand. Reese offered a soft, obedient smile and nodded slowly. Voss let go, patted his cheek in a way that made Reese's teeth itch, and said, "Good boy, stay obedient, you'll live very comfortably." He signaled his guards to leave. The moment Voss turned his back, the polite smile dropped off Reese's face entirely. "It's him," he broadcast, sharp enough to feel like a thrown blade. Poisons on his hands, literally caked into the gold filigree of those rings. He's too vain to realize his own jewelry is a signed confession. Across the castle, Kalen was already moving at a dead sprint, boots striking stone hard enough to send servants scattering out of his path. Two of Voss's personal guards stood outside the east wing doors, spears crossed. "Halt. Lord Voss is conducting private business." Kalen didn't slow down. He didn't draw his sword. He backhanded the first guard with an armored gauntlet, hard enough to send the man crashing into a pillar, unconscious before he hit the floor. The second dropped his spear and fled without a word. Inside the room, Reese crossed his arms, eyeing the back of Voss's head with the calm calculation of someone weighing options. I could end this right now. Sweep the knee, drop his center of gravity, rear naked choke, out cold in 6 seconds. Guards are a problem, but I could use his body as leverage. Kalen heard the entire plan and felt genuine panic spike through him. He knew the crown only worked one direction. He could hear Reese, but Reese couldn't hear him. "Do not engage him," he thought uselessly, breaking into a full sprint. "Stay back, he's dangerous. Stay back, you reckless idiot." "Time for a nap, Voss," Reese thought, dropping his stance, ready to launch himself across the room. The door exploded inward before he could move, wood splintering, hinges shrieking off the frame. Voss spun, robes flaring, hand darting for a hidden blade. King Kalen stood in the wreckage of the doorway, chest heaving, eyes gone entirely black with fury, a suffocating wave of alpha pheromones, dark sandalwood and something colder underneath it, rolling off him thick enough to taste. Voss choked on the scent and dropped to his knees without meaning to. "Your Majesty, I was merely instructing the concubine." Kalen didn't look at him. He crossed the room in 2 strides, eyes locked entirely on Riss, who stood frozen mid-stance, fists raised. Kalen saw the faint red marks on Riss's jaw where Voss had gripped him, and the last thread of his composure snapped clean. Oh, Riss thought, all combat strategy evaporating in an instant as the wall of pheromones hit him. Well, that's a lot of alpha. My knees feel unreasonably weak all of a sudden. Interesting. New data point. Kalen hauled Voss up by the collar with one hand, effortlessly, and roared for the guards. A dozen flooded in seconds later, staring at their terrified council head dangling from the king's fist. "The deep dungeons," Kalen ordered, tossing Voss toward them like discarded laundry. "High treason. If he speaks a single word on the way, cut out his tongue." The guards dragged Voss out, screaming, eager to escape the room's oppressive atmosphere themselves. Alone with Rhys, Kalen turned back, chest still heaving, rage still burning behind his eyes. Rhys swayed on his feet, the room tilted. Heat pooled low and sudden in his stomach. The stress, the danger, and now this overwhelming wall of protective alpha scent had triggered something his new biology had apparently been waiting to do this entire time. He recognized the sensation immediately, mostly from research he'd definitely done for entirely academic reasons. He was going into heat. "I think I need a different kind of physical therapy right now," his mind offered, breathless and entirely without its usual bravado. His legs gave out. Kalen caught him before he hit the floor, pulling the burning, trembling Omega against his chest. "Take me," Rhys's thoughts begged, all strategy gone, replaced by pure need. Not later, now. Kalen looked down at him, kicked the ruined door shut with one boot, and gave up entirely on holding back. The door slammed. Kalen leaned his back against the stone wall beside the broken frame, holding Rhys close, and for a moment the room was completely silent, the air thick with dark spice and sweetness. Rhys trembled against him, his internal thermostat entirely broken, a deep ache radiating from somewhere he had no name for yet. He'd read about heats in more novels than he'd ever admit to. Reading about it and living it, he was rapidly discovering, were not the same experience at all. "Put me down," his mind broadcast, breathless. "No, wait, don't put me down. Put me on the desk. The mahogany one. Sweep the reports off first." Kalen's pupils blew out completely black. He forced himself to ignore the desk. His Omega deserved better than that, whatever his own instincts were screaming, and carried Rhys to the canopy bed instead, laying him down with a gentleness that made the moment feel almost sacred. "You're burning up," Kalen said, voice rough. "I'm aware," Rhys thought, burying his face against Kalen's neck, breathing him in. "It's a physiological response, not a diagnosis. Hurry up, your pace is unacceptably leisurely. Engage your calves." Kalen let out a startled huff of laughter despite everything, and finally stopped holding back. Hours passed. The room went quiet again, the only sound left their breathing, slow and synced. Kalen kept his weight braced carefully over Rhys, arms wrapped tight around his waist. Rhys stroked the king's damp hair with fingers that had finally stopped shaking, muscles loose and warm, the burning need replaced with a deep, settled satisfaction. 10 out of 10, his mind offered sleepily. 5 stars. Would absolutely recommend. "Though tomorrow, Your Majesty, we're working on your hamstring mobility. Non-negotiable." Kalen smiled against his skin, closed his eyes, and thought, not for the first time that week, but for the first time without any panic attached to it, that he was entirely, hopelessly ruined. Morning light spilled through the tall windows onto a bedchamber that looked like it had survived a small skirmish. The door still hung off its hinges. The sheets were a lost cause. Kalen lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, feeling more thoroughly at peace than he had in years. For the first time since his consort's death, the weight in his chest had lifted. Rhys was sprawled across his chest, dead to the world, dark hair a wreck, the scent of sandalwood settled deep into his skin. Kalen wrapped an arm around him and didn't move for a long while, listening to him breathe. Eventually Rhys stirred, stretched, and winced. "Good morning," his mind offered into the quiet room. "My glutes are extremely sore, good kind of sore, 10 out of 10 session." Kalen's chest rumbled with a laugh he didn't bother suppressing. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made Rhys prop himself up, confused. Kalen sat up, pulled the ruined sheets over them both, and reached for the crown resting on the nightstand. "The seal on your neck," he began carefully. "It isn't just a mark of ownership, it's old magic. It links your mind to the royal bloodline. When I wear this or when I'm close enough to you without it," he braced, clearly expecting fury, "I can hear you. Every thought." Rhys's eyes went very wide. "He can hear me." Panic lasted about 2 full seconds before every single comment about pelvic floors, protein shakes, and latissimus dorsi replayed itself in horrifying detail. Rhys buried his face in his hands, mortified beyond words. Kalen braced for tears. What he got instead was Rhys shaking with silent, helpless laughter. "You heard everything," his mind broadcast, dripping with sudden, delighted smugness. This actually makes things so much easier. I don't have to write it all down anymore. Kalen frowned. I have questions. Voss clearly trained you in some kind of dark art. Your vocabulary is terrifying. I require a translation. Rhys folded his arms on Kalen's chest, grinning. Ask away, Your Majesty. What is a dumbbell? Is it explosive? Rhys bit back a laugh. It's a weight. We lift them to build muscle. Not a weapon, unless you drop one on your foot. And a protein shake? A recovery drink? You're built like a fortress wall. I assumed you drank a gallon of them daily. Kalen relaxed slightly, filing the terms away as strange but harmless. Then his voice dropped. There's one more thing. On the balcony, you asked me to destroy your pelvic floor. Rhys covered his mouth, shoulders shaking. I need to know, Kalen pressed, entirely serious. Is that a threat? Were you asking me to break your bones? No, Rhys managed, wiping his eyes. It's modern slang. It means I wanted you to do exactly what you did last night, possibly a little harder next time. Kalen stared at him, thoroughly speechless, a blush crawling from his ears down his scarred neck. You are an educated menace. I'm your educated menace, Rhys corrected cheerfully. Now, politics. What are we doing about the man currently rotting in your dungeon? The playful mood evaporated instantly. Kalen's expression hardened back into the king's face. It's not simple. He's the head of the Privy Council. His allies are already demanding his release, and they've found a loophole. They're calling it minor discipline of a servant, and threatening to hold up grain shipments to the north if I don't release him under a decree of mercy. I need him caught in an act no loophole can undo. Something public. Rhys sat up, letting the sheet fall without a second thought, mind already shifting into strategy mode. Arresting him for touching a concubine won't hold. We let him out. We back him into a corner. He knows I smelled the poison. He knows I'm a threat now. He'll come after me to protect himself. Absolutely not. Kalen's jaw locked. He nearly crushed your throat once already. I won't let him near you again. Exactly, Rhys pressed. So we let him try, and we catch him doing it in front of the entire court. The garden party is next week. Every lord in the kingdom will be there. No, I'll be bait. It's too dangerous. Kalen gripped his shoulders. You're an Omega. He'll bring armed men. I won't risk your life to prove a point. Rhys pulled his arm free and flexed, unimpressed. Look at this. Muscle density, core strength, years of combat conditioning. I am not a fragile flower, Kalen. Kalen looked at the flexed arm, remembered the library, and let out a long, reluctant breath. It hadn't been a fluke, and he knew it. I felt your technique. But a grapple isn't a sword fight. A blade doesn't care how strong your grip is. Rhys moved before he'd finished the sentence, grabbed his wrist, twisted, applied just enough pressure to lock the elbow in place without breaking anything. Kalen gasped, trapped, unable to move without dislocating his own arm. Leverage beats mass. Rhys said simply, I don't need to beat every guard in that garden. I just need to take Voss down. You handle the rest. We're a team. Kalen rubbed his elbow once Rhys let go, staring at him with a mixture of awe and genuine terror. The man was, without question, a menace, beautiful, brilliant, and entirely too dangerous for his own good. He sighed, already knowing he'd lost this argument. We set the trap at the garden party. If he gets within 2 feet of you, I'm taking his head myself. Deal, Rhys agreed happily, leaning up to kiss his cheek. Now that that's settled, we have free time. Let's revisit your cardiovascular endurance. Kalen groaned, but pulled him back down onto the ruined sheets anyway. The royal gardens were in full bloom, silk banners snapping gently in the spring wind, the whole Privy Council gathered under the pretense of celebration. It looked, to any passing noble, like a perfectly ordinary afternoon. It was, in fact, a carefully constructed trap. Kalen stood on a raised stone balcony in formal armor, watching the crowd with cold, calculating eyes. He hated every second of this plan. He wanted Rhys locked safely behind the broken door in the east wing. Rhys, predictably, had insisted otherwise. He wore the crown, keeping the link open, listening to the steady stream of his Omega's thoughts drift up from the party below. Rhys moved through the crowd in a flowing white tunic, slate and chalk held close for appearances. Still need this for the nobles, he thought, nodding politely to a passing lord while looking for all the world like the perfect tragic concubine. Internally, he was running through a warm-up routine. Calves feel good, hamstrings loose, core engaged, center of gravity low. I'm ready. Where's the creepy politician? Kalen's knuckles went white on the railing. Voss had been released under a decree of mercy days earlier, framed as royal magnanimity, really a calculated risk to draw him back out into the open. Voss appeared on the garden path with his usual arrogant swagger, 2 guards flanking him. He spotted Rhys near the fountain, signaled a passing servant for 2 goblets of dark wine, and walked over with a predator's smile. "Here we go," Rhys noted calmly, watching him approach. Still terrible posture, practically begging for a hip toss. "A drink?" "Concubine," Voss said loudly, making sure the surrounding nobles heard every word. "To celebrate my return to the court's good graces. The king is merciful." Rhys took the goblet, brought it close to his face, and caught it instantly. A sharp, bitter note of raw copper and crushed almonds. A lethal dose, undiluted. Voss wasn't taking chances this time. "Confirmed," Rhys broadcast. "Poison's in the cup, predictable to the very end. Let's ruin his whole week." He tipped his head back dramatically and let the wine pour down his chin instead of his throat, staining his white tunic a red that looked exactly like blood. He dropped the goblet, clutched his own throat with both hands, and collapsed to his knees before pitching face first onto the grass. Excellent form on the fall, he thought, perfectly still. Chin tucked, spine aligned, no head trauma. 10 out of 10. "I want an award for this," the nobles shrieked. Fans hit the ground. Voss laughed, cold and satisfied, and stepped closer, glancing up at the balcony to make sure the king was watching. He snapped his fingers. 5 servants dropped their trays and pulled hidden swords, charging the balcony stairs toward the royal guard. Voss looked back down at Rhys, gloating. "Foolish little thing. Did you really believe a pretty face would save you?" Rhys opened his eyes. He didn't bother standing. He spun on his back, whip fast, and swept Voss's ankles out from under him with brutal precision. Voss hit the ground hard, breath punched clean out of his lungs. Rhys was already moving, using his core to launch upright, grabbing Voss's arm, twisting his hips, throwing a leg over the man's shoulder to lock the position. A perfect textbook armbar, Voss screamed. 1 more inch of struggle and his elbow would go the wrong direction entirely. Up on the balcony, Kaelin didn't wait for his guards. He vaulted the stone railing, dropped 15 feet, and landed on the grass without so much as a stumble. The 5 assassins hesitated for exactly 1 fatal second. Kaelin moved through them like a shadow, disarming 3 with his bare hands before the remaining 2 dropped their weapons and fled. The first assassin swung wide, overcommitted, and Kaelin simply wasn't where the blade landed anymore, already inside the man's guard, driving an elbow into his sternum hard enough to fold him in half. The second lasted marginally longer, a full 2 exchanges, before Kaelin wrenched the sword out of his grip and used the flat of it to put him face first into the grass. The third took 1 look at what had happened to the other 2 and made the eminently reasonable decision to simply drop his weapon and run, which didn't save him from a guard's spear butt to the back of the skull 30 seconds later. It was, all things considered, a short fight. Kaelin hadn't drawn his own blade once. The real spectacle, though, was by the fountain, where the delicate, silent concubine had the head of the Privy Council pinned to the ground and looking distinctly unimpressed about it. Rhys reached out with his free hand, retrieved his slate, and wrote a single tidy line, holding it up for the horrified crowd to read. "Please fetch the guards." Flawless joint manipulation, he thought, thoroughly pleased with himself. Perfect leverage. Didn't even pull anything. "Kaelin, did you see that?" Kaelin crossed the grass, stepping over groaning would-be assassins, and looked down at Voss with an expression that made several nearby lords take an involuntary step back. Then he looked at Rhys, and the fury melted into something warmer entirely. "I saw it," he said quietly, "just for Rhys." "Magnificent, your technique is flawless." He released the arm lock himself, hauled Rhys gently to his feet, and dusted the grass off his ruined, wine-stained tunic while the royal guards clamped iron shackles on Voss's wrists. A vial of poison turned up in his robes almost immediately, along with the same bitter residue clinging to the filigree of his rings that had given him away in the first place. In front of the entire court, there was no loophole left to hide behind. "Take him to the deepest cell," Kaelin ordered, voice carrying across the stunned garden. "He faces the executioner at dawn." The guards dragged Voss away, still screaming. The nobles murmured, stunned, watching Rhys with an expression that had shifted overnight from pity to genuine awe. Kaelin turned to address them, raising a hand for silence. "The Privy Council is purged of its rot. The kingdom is secure, and I owe my life to the bravery of my concubine." He didn't wait for the murmurs to finish. He crossed to Rhys, pulled him against his armored chest, and wrapped him up entirely, uncaring of the watching court. Excellent grip strength, Rhys thought happily, arms looping around his neck. You smell incredible after a fight, very intense pheromone situation. Fully approve. Kalen laughed, low and warm, and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Come, he said softly. You need a clean tunic, and I believe we should discuss a reward. I accept rewards in the form of heavy lifting, Rhys thought, already grinning. Take me back to the East Wing, Your Majesty. We have more anatomy left to study. Kalen swept him up and carried him straight out of the garden, and the Frost King, for once, looked entirely and happily conquered. The great hall had changed. The heaviness that used to hang in the air was simply gone. Voss was locked away in the deepest cell in the kingdom, his allies scattered and thoroughly cowed, the council quiet for the first time in years. King Kalen sat on the obsidian throne, in formal leather armor, the silver crown resting on his brow, looking, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely victorious. The doors opened. Rhys walked in wearing a stunning blue silk tunic, slate held loosely in one hand out of old habit, looking every inch the perfect obedient concubine. His internal monologue told an entirely different story. Look at him. He owns this room. That posture is magnificent. Core stability top tier. He looks like a war god, and he's mine. Kalon heard every word and couldn't stop the smile from breaking across his face. He rose, descended the marble steps, and reached Rhys before he could drop into his usual bow. He caught the slate gently, tucking it against Rhys's side instead of letting him kneel. You won't need that anymore, Kalen said, his voice carrying through the empty hall. I'll gladly be your voice in this court. You'll never be ignored again. He dropped to one knee. Oh my gods, Rhys's mind screamed. That hip mobility, flawless knee flexion, what is happening right now? Kalen pulled a gold ring from inside his armor, a single flawless diamond catching the candlelight. You saved my life, he said quietly. You saved my kingdom. You showed me a kind of loyalty I'd stopped believing existed. I won't call you a concubine anymore. Be my consort, be my husband, rule beside me. Rhys pressed a hand to his mouth, eyes stinging. Yes, he broadcast, unfiltered and entirely sincere, 1,000 times yes. Put that ring on my finger and then take me to bed. We're celebrating with cardio. Kalen laughed, sliding the ring on, a perfect fit, and pulled Rhys up into a kiss right there in front of the returning court, claiming him without a single ounce of royal restraint left. The wedding took place 3 weeks later. The capital celebrated for days. The great hall was draped floor to ceiling in white winter roses. Kalen stood at the altar in ceremonial armor that made half the room forget how to breathe. Rhys walked down the aisle in a tailored white silk suit, looking every bit a king in his own right. They exchanged vows under the high priest's watch, and Rhys spent the entire ceremony privately calculating exactly how fast that armor could come off later. The 3 weeks leading up to it had not been quiet. Word of the garden ambush had spread through the capital within a day, embellished a little more with every retelling, until half the city was convinced the new royal consort had personally thrown Lord Voss into the fountain with his bare hands. Nobles who had once looked at Rhys with pity now looked at him with something closer to wary respect, which Rhys found endlessly funny and Kalen found, privately, deeply gratifying. The council, what remained of it, considerably thinner and considerably more cooperative than before, had approved the marriage without a single dissenting vote, which Kalen noted was either a genuine show of support or the fastest anyone in that room had ever agreed on anything out of pure self-preservation. Possibly both. Rhys had insisted on choosing his own wedding attire over the objections of no fewer than 3 royal tailors, all of whom wanted him in something considerably more traditional and considerably less form-fitting. He won that argument the same way he won most arguments with Kaelin's household staff, through sheer, cheerful, immovable stubbornness, and the faint but unmistakable implication that he knew several ways to dislocate a shoulder if pushed too hard. By the morning of the ceremony, the tailors had stopped arguing entirely and simply handed him pins. The feast afterward passed in a blur. Kaelin's patience gave out well before dessert. He pulled Rhys to his feet the moment it was even remotely acceptable to leave, and they were gone before most of the guests noticed. The royal bedchamber was warm, a fire cracking in the hearth, the air thick with sandalwood and winter spice. The doors closed, the lock clicked. Rhys dropped every last trace of his polite facade and jumped him, a genuinely perfect mount, legs locked around Kaelin's waist. Easily caught, backed against the door. You're impatient, Kalen rumbled. I smiled at 100 boring lords today, Rhys thought back. This is my time now. What happened after that gets considerably more detailed than this platform allows. Again, the full scene lives on the Patreon if you want it. We'll pick back up the next morning. Sunlight crept through the arched windows the following day, spilling across a bed that had clearly seen better days. Rhys woke slowly, every muscle pleasantly wrecked, a fresh mating mark throbbing gently at his throat. Kaelin was already awake beside him, propped on one elbow, tracing lazy circles across his shoulder, looking more at peace than Rhys had ever seen him, the shadows under his eyes finally, completely gone. "Good morning, husband," Rhys thought sleepily. "My back is destroyed. You owe me a massage." Kaelin laughed, the sound rumbling through his whole chest, and reached up to trace the fresh mark on Rhys's neck, his eyes gone soft with something that had nothing to do with strategy or crowns or politics at all. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too," Rhys thought back, entirely unguarded for once. "Look at your face. Ridiculously handsome. We need to get you an enormous breakfast. Venison, probably. Gotta maintain those gains." Kaelin laughed out loud and pressed a kiss to the mark on his neck. "And I will eat whatever you command," he said. The Frost King was, officially and happily, whipped for life, and fully prepared to spend the rest of it listening to whatever strange modern nonsense ran through his husband's head, translating it for a confused court one word at a time if he had to. It was, all things considered, a very happy ending, the kind neither of them had ever expected to get, and both of them, in their own stubborn way, had fought hard enough to earn. If this story pulled at something in you, tell us which moment hit hardest in the comments. We read every single one. A like helps this story reach someone who needs it, and subscribing means you will not miss the next one we bring to life. Thank you for spending this time with us.